Let me tell you something, and I want you to really sit with this before you judge me. I have trained soldiers from 11 different star systems. I have trained warriors who could bite through titanium plating without blinking. I have trained twin siblings who communicated through scent alone, which, trust me, is a nightmare when you're trying to run a disciplined training session. I have trained creatures who once ate an entire practice target because they got hungry halfway through a drill. And in all those years, all those decades, all those headaches, nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the day a human woman walked into my range and made my jaw drop clean off my face. My name is Creever Desane. I am a Thessarin, which means I have 4 arms, gray leathery skin, and a face that other species describe as unsettling but weirdly trustworthy. I have been a weapons instructor at the Coalition Officer Academy for 31 years, standard time. I have seen recruits cry. I have seen recruits vomit. I have seen recruits, on one memorable occasion, attempt to fight a training drone with their bare teeth. So, when I tell you today's story shocked me, understand that shocking me takes real effort. I am basically emotionally armor-plated at this point. But here we are. When the humans first joined the coalition, I was, let us say, unimpressed. They are soft. They are pink mostly, unless they are not pink, in which case they are brown or some shade in between. And none of these colors mean anything about how tough they are, which is confusing because on my homeworld, skin color tells you everything. Humans have no claws, no natural armor, no venom. Their teeth are flat and useless, like they evolved specifically to chew salad instead of enemies. When the first batch of human cadets arrived at the academy, I remember turning to my colleague, a Verdane named Osamir Krell, and saying, "They are going to break like twigs." Osamir, mark my words, twigs. Osamir Krell is a Verdane, a species with skin like tree bark and a personality like a damp cave. He does not laugh. He does not smile. He communicates almost entirely through slow blinks and heavy sighs. When I made my comment about the humans breaking like twigs, Osamir blinked at me twice, which in Verdane culture means roughly you have no idea what you are talking about, but I am too tired to argue. I should have listened to the blinking. Let me set the scene properly because you deserve the full picture, not some rush summary. The Coalition Officer Academy sits on a moon called Varan X Station, orbiting a gas giant that looks like a giant marble somebody forgot to put away. The academy is enormous, filled with polished metal corridors and training halls big enough to fit a small starship. It trains officers from every species in the coalition, teaching them tactics, diplomacy, engineering, and, most importantly for this story, weapons handling. Deep inside the armory wing, past 3 security checkpoints and 1 very grumpy administrative droid named Talk, there is a vault. We call it the Forbidden Rack, though officially it has some long, boring designation number that nobody uses because Forbidden Rack sounds cooler. And honestly, we are professionals, but we are not above a little drama. Inside that vault sits a weapon called the Draventh Longarm. The Draventh Longarm was designed by an extinct species called the Draventh. May they rest in whatever weird alien afterlife they believed in, because these people clearly had a personal vendetta against joints, ligaments, and basic anatomy. The rifle fires a compressed plasma slug at such an extreme velocity that the recoil alone has broken cadets' shoulders. Not bruised, broken. We are talking full-on snap, medical bay, several weeks of recovery. Broken. The rifle requires, according to every official manual, every safety regulation, and every ounce of common sense in the galaxy, 2 hands and a shoulder brace to fire safely. Even then, most cadets fire once, maybe twice, before they call it quits and go find a nice, quiet corner to sit down in. We have had exactly 1 cadet, a massive warrior named Dragsulon, manage 5 shots using both hands before his shoulder brace cracked clean in half. Nobody, and I want to stress this, nobody has ever fired that weapon one-handed. It is not in the manual because it is not something any sane person would attempt. It would be like trying to catch a moving ground car with your bare hands and expecting to walk away with all your fingers. So that is the weapon. Now, let me introduce you to the human who decided none of that mattered. Her name was Vesper Cain. Vesper was, on paper, entirely unremarkable. Average height for a human female, dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, quiet demeanor. The kind of cadet who sits in the back of the classroom and never raises her hand unless directly called upon. She scored well on tactical exams, adequately on physical assessments, and had a disciplinary record so clean it was almost suspicious. If you had shown me her file and asked me to guess her future, I would have said, solid officer. Forgettable. Will retire quietly after 20 years of competent but unspectacular service. I would have been wrong about basically everything, but that is becoming a running theme with humans. So, let us move on. The other cadets did not pay Vesper much attention either. Humans, as a species, get underestimated constantly, and not just by us aliens. Even among their own kind, there is something about the way they carry themselves, casual, almost lazy, like they are perpetually one step away from taking a nap, that makes people forget they are, biologically speaking, absolute walking tanks held together by stubbornness and bad decisions. One cadet in particular loved underestimating people. His name was Draxos Cull, a Catherine, a species built like walking boulders with attitude problems. Draxos was loud. Draxos was cocky. Draxos had failed the advanced marksmanship exam twice and blamed both failures on, and I quote directly from his written appeal, faulty equipment and jealous instructors. Draxos did not care for humans. He thought they were weak, soft, and undeserving of coalition membership, and he made sure everyone around him knew his opinion, whether they asked for it or not. It was Draxos, naturally, who started the whole mess. It happened during a routine equipment inspection day, which sounds boring because it is boring, but stay with me. Cadets rotated through the armory to learn about weapon classifications, safety protocols, maintenance schedules, and other standard procedures. A group of cadets, including Draxos, were walking past the forbidden rack when someone, I believe it was a Bellinar cadet named Nixel, mentioned the Longarm's reputation. Nobody's ever fired it one-handed, Nixel said, practically glowing with the drama of the statement. Not one person. Not ever. Draxos predictably snorted. Because nobody's stupid enough to try. Except maybe a human. You people don't respect rules that don't make sense to you, right? Isn't that basically your whole personality now? Here is where things get interesting. Vesper, who had been mostly silent during the entire tour, simply shrugged and said, and again, I have this on official record because Osamir was standing nearby and reported the exact words. Yeah, pretty much. If a rule doesn't have a good reason behind it, I generally figure it's more of a suggestion. Draxos laughed. A big, booming, mocking laugh. Prove it then. Pick up the Longarm. One hand. Right now. I want to be very clear here. This should have ended immediately. Any responsible instructor, any responsible academy, any responsible anyone would have shut this down instantly. And, to my credit, I tried. When word reached me that a cadet was being dared into handling the forbidden rifle unsupervised, I marched down to that armory faster than I had moved in 15 years, ready to end this nonsense before someone lost an arm. Here is the thing about the Coalition Academy administration. They love, and I mean love, a teaching moment. When Commandant Hava Thorn, a sharp-eyed Illan woman who runs this academy with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a saint, heard what was happening, instead of shutting it down, she got curious. Interesting, Thorn said, arriving on the scene with her usual quiet authority. Under full supervision, safety protocols active, medical team on standby. If Cadet Cull wants to issue challenges, then the Academy will make it official, and we will all learn something today. I protested. Osamir blinked at me sympathetically, which is about as much emotional support as you get from a Verdane. But the order stood. And so, against every instinct I had built over 3 decades of teaching, I found myself standing in the main range, watching a human cadet approach the forbidden rack like she was picking out a snack from a vending machine. Let me describe the Draventh Longarm to you properly, because you need to understand what this weapon actually is before I tell you what happened next. The Longarm is nearly 1.5 meters in length. Its barrel is reinforced with a compressed alloy that most species cannot even lift comfortably with 2 hands, let alone 1. The firing mechanism draws power from an internal plasma cell that builds pressure with every pull of the trigger, releasing a slug that travels at speeds that would make most projectile weapons in the galaxy look like children's toys. The recoil, and I cannot stress this enough, is the real killer here. It is not a gentle push backward. It is a violent, joint-wrenching, bone-rattling kick that travels up through the wrist, the elbow, the shoulder, and into the spine if you are not braced properly. We keep a two-handed shoulder brace mounted on the weapon specifically because, without it, the recoil alone can dislocate a shoulder on the first shot. I have seen it happen. I have heard the pop. It is not a sound you forget. Vesper walked up to the rack, and Talk, our administrative droid, practically had a mechanical panic attack trying to read her the 17-page safety waiver before letting her touch it. She signed it without reading a word, which, honestly, should have worried me more than it did at the time. She lifted the rifle. One hand. I remember the room going very quiet. Cadets who had gathered to watch, expecting a laugh at Draxos's little prank, suddenly stopped murmuring. Draxos himself, standing off to the side with his arms crossed and a smug grin plastered across his rocky face, watched with the confidence of someone who fully expected this to end in humiliation. Though I am not sure whose humiliation he was expecting exactly. Vesper checked the weapon over, running her fingers along the barrel, testing the weight, adjusting her grip like she was evaluating a used ground car before deciding whether to buy it. Completely casual. Completely unbothered. She did not look nervous. She did not look excited. She looked, honestly, mildly inconvenienced. The way you look when someone asks you to carry one more grocery bag than you were planning on carrying. You sure about this? I asked her, because someone needed to give this poor woman one last chance to back out gracefully. She looked at me, gave a small shrug and said, "Rules that don't make sense are suggestions, right? Let's see how strong this suggestion is." And then she raised the rifle one-handed, aimed down the range at the target 60 meters out, and pulled the trigger. The sound was massive. A deep, cracking boom that echoed off the walls of the range and rattled the observation windows. I braced myself. Genuinely. Physically braced myself for the sound of a shoulder popping out of its socket. For a scream. For chaos. None of that happened. Vesper's arm kicked back. Sure, that recoil is no joke, but she absorbed it. Her stance shifted slightly, her feet adjusted. Her whole body seemed to flow with the impact rather than fight against it, like a tree bending in a strong wind instead of snapping. The rifle settled. She lowered it slightly, glanced at the target readout, and I swear on every ancestor I have, she looked almost bored. The target display flashed. Center mass. Dead center. The room stayed silent for exactly 3 seconds, which does not sound like a long time, but trust me, in a room full of cadets who had just watched something they thought was physically impossible, 3 seconds of silence feels like an eternity. Then the whispering started. "Again," Commandant Thorne said calmly, though I noticed her eyes had narrowed with genuine interest. Vesper raised the rifle again. Second shot. Same boom. Same violent kick. Same casual absorption of force that should have, by every law of physics I understood, sent her stumbling backward or worse. Center mass again, this time slightly left of the first shot, but still comfortably within kill zone parameters. Third shot. I found myself leaning forward, my forearms crossed tightly, watching this woman fire a weapon that had broken the bones of cadets twice her size. And she was standing there like she was waiting for a bus. By the fourth shot, word had spread through the academy like wildfire through dry grass. Cadets started pouring into the observation area above the range. I saw Nixel, the Belliner, practically vibrating with excitement. His species-sent glands going into overdrive with what I can only assume was pure alien astonishment. I saw other instructors arriving, curious about what the commotion was. Even Osamir Krell, a man who does not get excited about anything, had wandered over and his blinking pattern had noticeably sped up, which, for him, is basically the equivalent of jumping up and down and screaming. "How is she doing that?" Osamir whispered to me, and it was the most words I had heard from him in a single sentence in about 6 years. "I have no idea," I whispered back, "but I am starting to feel personally insulted by it." Vesper fired her 5th shot, then her 6th. Each impact was tight, controlled, and grouped so closely together on the target that, from a distance, it almost looked like one single, slightly larger hole rather than 6 separate ones. Her stance never wavered. Her breathing, from what I could observe, remained steady. At one point, between shots 5 and 6, she rolled her shoulder like she was working out a minor stiffness, the way you would after carrying groceries up a few flights of stairs. Then she made a small joke to nobody in particular. Guess I skipped leg day for this one, she muttered. Which made absolutely no sense because we were talking about an arm, not legs. But apparently this is some kind of human gym humor. And honestly, considering what I was watching, I was willing to forgive her the confusing joke. By the 7th shot, the observation deck was completely packed. Cadets from other training sessions had abandoned their assignments entirely to come watch. I even saw a few Academy staff members who had no business being anywhere near the range, drawn by the rumor spreading through every corridor of Varanex Station that a human cadet was doing something impossible with the forbidden rifle. Commandant Thorne herself had moved closer to the range floor, her arms folded, watching with an expression I had genuinely never seen on her face before. Something between professional curiosity and quiet alarm. The kind of look you give when you realize the universe is slightly bigger and stranger than you previously understood. Meanwhile, Draxo's Kul's arms, once confidently crossed, now hung loosely at his sides. His rocky face, which typically radiated smug confidence, had settled into something closer to confusion mixed with dawning horror. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Shot 8. Same result. Center mass. Tight grouping. Recoil absorbed like it was nothing more than a minor breeze. Shot 9. This is where things got, and I use this word very deliberately, ridiculous. The recoil on shot 9 should have been compounding at this point. 9 consecutive one-handed shots from a weapon that most soldiers cannot fire twice without needing medical attention. Her arm should have been shaking. Her aim should have been degrading. Instead, if anything, her shots were getting tighter. By this point, the entire range had gone completely silent except for the boom of each shot and the soft murmur of disbelief rippling through the crowd after every impact. I stood there, my 4 arms crossed, my jaw slightly slack, watching decades of my professional understanding of weapons handling get quietly dismantled by a woman whom, 20 minutes earlier, I would have described as solid but unspectacular. Shot 10. The boom echoed through the range one final time. Vesper's arm kicked back, absorbed the impact with that same infuriatingly casual stance, and settled. She lowered the rifle, engaged the safety without being told, and turned to look at the target readout. The 10th shot had done something none of us had ever seen before. It had struck so precisely, so exactly in line with the previous shots, that it had literally split one of the earlier bullet holes clean through the middle, widening it rather than creating a new mark entirely. 10 shots, one-handed, from a weapon designed by an extinct species with an apparent grudge against joints, and the target looked less like it had been shot 10 times and more like it had been shot once very precisely by something with terrifyingly good aim. The silence after the 10th shot lasted maybe 2 full seconds before the entire observation deck erupted. Cadets shouting, some cheering, some just yelling in shock. Nixel the Belliner was practically climbing over the railing trying to get a better look at the target, his scent glands working overtime. Osamir Krell, standing beside me, had stopped blinking entirely, which honestly concerned me more than anything else that had happened all day. Draxo's Kul stood frozen. His rocky complexion somehow managed to look pale, which should be biologically impossible for his species, but grief and humiliation apparently find a way. Commandant Thorne walked onto the range floor, approached Vesper directly, and studied the target for a long moment before turning to look at the young cadet standing casually beside the rifle rack, rubbing her shoulder like she had just finished a light workout. "Cadet Cain," Commandant Thorne said slowly, "would you care to explain how you just did that?" Vesper shrugged. "Honestly, ma'am, I'm not entirely sure myself. It just felt like a normal recoil. A strong one. Sure. But nothing my arm couldn't handle. Nothing her arm couldn't handle. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment because I certainly had to. Now look, I know some of you listening to this are probably thinking, come on, Creever, can't be that impressive. Maybe the weapon was malfunctioning. Maybe it was some kind of fluke. I understand the skepticism. I felt it too initially. So later that day, after the crowds dispersed and the range returned to something resembling normal, I sat down with our medical and engineering teams to actually figure out what in the galaxy had just happened. Turns out, and this is the part that genuinely humbled me, humans are absurd creatures from a purely physiological standpoint. Their bone density, while not the highest in the coalition, is distributed in a way that allows for incredible force absorption through their joints. Their muscle fiber composition allows for both explosive power and sustained tension, a combination that apparently very few species manage simultaneously. But here is the real kicker. The thing that truly explains what happened on that range. Humans train through pain. This is not a joke. This is not an exaggeration. Our medical officer, a Threxian named Dr. Havmar, who has studied human physiology extensively since the Coalition first made contact, explained it to me in terms I will simplify here because her original explanation involved a lot of complicated words I had to look up afterward. Most species in the Coalition, myself included, are wired to avoid pain instinctively. Pain means danger. Pain means stop. It is a survival mechanism baked into our biology over millions of years of evolution. Humans, however, evolved in an environment so consistently hostile, so relentlessly difficult, that pain avoidance alone was not enough to survive. They had to learn to push through discomfort, to work despite injury, and to keep going when every rational instinct screamed to stop. It is not that human pain receptors are different, Dr. Havmar told me. It is that their entire cultural and physiological relationship with pain is different. They have spent their entire history training their bodies and minds to treat discomfort as an obstacle to work around rather than a wall to stop at. Combine that with their bone and muscle structure, and you get a species capable of absorbing recoil forces that would break most of us, simply because their brains do not immediately panic and lock up their muscles in response to that stress. I sat there processing this information, feeling my worldview shift slightly. So you're telling me, I said slowly, that a human can fire a weapon designed to break bones one-handed repeatedly because their species collectively decided pain is more of a suggestion than a rule? Dr. Havmar just looked at me and said, "Welcome to Understanding Humans, Instructor Desane. It gets weirder from here." And it did, because after the story of Vesper Cain's 10 shots spread through Varanek Station, and believe me, it spread fast, other instructors started digging into human training records more carefully. We found reports of human soldiers finishing combat objectives with broken bones because they did not realize the injury had happened until after the mission ended. We found records of human athletes competing through injuries that would have ended the careers, and possibly the lives, of soldiers from other species. We found an entire cultural history of humans treating physical limits as things to be pushed past rather than respected, which, from a purely academic standpoint, is either the most inspiring thing I have ever studied or the most terrifying. And I genuinely cannot decide which. Back on the range, in the immediate aftermath of the 10th shot, the practical consequences were already unfolding. Commandant Thorn ordered the Draventh Longarm's classification updated immediately, adding a new designation category that had never existed before in Academy history: human compatible. Every other species remained restricted to two-handed use with the shoulder brace. Humans, apparently, were now cleared for one-handed operation pending further physiological review, which is Academy speak for, we have no idea what just happened, but we are updating the paperwork anyway. Draxos Kull, for his part, did not handle the aftermath gracefully. He tried, in the days that followed, to claim the whole thing was rigged, that Vesper must have had some kind of modified equipment, that the weapon must have been tampered with. Commandant Thorn, showing remarkable patience, allowed a full equipment review, which, of course, found nothing wrong with the rifle whatsoever. It fired exactly as designed. Vesper simply fired it better than anyone had ever expected a living being to fire it. After the review confirmed there had been no tampering, Draxos's reputation among the cadets took a noticeable hit. It is one thing to lose a bet. It is another thing entirely to lose a bet, then accuse the winner of cheating, then get publicly proven wrong in front of the entire Academy. Nixel the Belliner, who apparently held on to grudges about as well as his species held on to common sense, made sure to mention the incident to Draxos at every possible opportunity for the following several weeks, which I found deeply satisfying to witness. Professionally speaking, of course. As for Vesper herself, she handled the sudden fame about as well as she handled everything else, which is to say with the enthusiasm of someone being asked to attend a slightly boring meeting. She gave a brief statement to the Academy newsletter, something along the lines of, "I just did what felt natural. I didn't realize it was going to be a big deal." And then she went back to her regular training schedule like nothing had happened. I approached her personally a few days after the incident, mostly out of professional curiosity and partly because I genuinely wanted to understand what had gone through her mind while she was standing on that range. "Cadet Cain," I said, "I have been doing this job for 31 years. I have never seen anything like what you did on that range. I need to understand. Were you not afraid? Even a little?" She considered the question for a moment, which I appreciated because it meant she was not just giving me some rehearsed, confident answer for the sake of looking impressive. "Honestly, sir," she said, "I was a little worried the first shot might hurt more than I expected, but once I felt the recoil, once I understood what I was working with, it just became a problem to solve. Like, okay, this is going to kick hard. How do I redirect that force instead of fighting it?" After that, it was just repetition. Humans are pretty good at repetition, even when things hurt a little. Even when things hurt a little. I wrote that phrase down afterward because I wanted to remember it exactly as she said it, because it perfectly captures something I have come to understand about humans in the months since this incident. They do not treat pain the way the rest of us do. They treat it like an inconvenient coworker, something to be managed and worked around rather than something that stops them entirely. News of the incident eventually spread beyond Varen X Station altogether. Other Coalition Academy branches started requesting the incident report, curious whether their own human cadets might demonstrate similar physiological quirks. I have heard through informal channels that at least 3 other academies have since documented similar, though slightly less dramatic, incidents of human cadets handling weapons and equipment that should have been physically impossible for them to manage. Apparently, Vesper Cain was not some singular anomaly. She was simply the first documented case that made everyone else start paying closer attention. Commandant Thorne, in her closing remarks during the official incident review, made a comment that I think summarizes this entire situation better than I ever could. She said, and I am quoting this directly because I wrote it down at the time, "We joined this coalition assuming humans were simply another species to integrate, another set of variables to account for in our training protocols. What we are discovering instead is that humans may require an entirely new category of understanding altogether. Their limitations are not our limitations. Their fears are not always our fears. And apparently, their relationship with physical pain operates on principles we are only beginning to understand. As for the Draventh Longarm itself, it has become something of an unofficial rite of passage for human cadets at Varen X Station. Not officially sanctioned, mind you, the Academy would never admit to encouraging cadets to fire a historically dangerous weapon just to see what happens. But unofficially, word has definitely spread among incoming human recruits, and more than a few have quietly requested access to test themselves against it. The results, from what I have heard, have been consistently impressive, if never quite as dramatically flawless as Vesper's original 10 shots. There was one particular follow-up case a few months later that I think is worth mentioning here because it shows this was not some strange one-time coincidence. A new human cadet named Corwin Ash, a broad-shouldered recruit with a reputation for stubbornness even among his own species, requested formal clearance to attempt the long arm after hearing about Vesper's performance from 3 different sources within his first week at the Academy. Commandant Thorne, now considerably less hesitant than she had been the first time around, approved a supervised trial. Corwin managed 8 shots, one-handed, before his grip finally began to falter on the 9th, at which point he made the sensible decision to stop rather than push his luck further. 8 shots. Still an entirely unprecedented number for any non-human cadet in the Academy's recorded history. And yet, somehow, the general reaction among the staff was something closer to mild disappointment, as though Vesper's original 10-shot performance had already recalibrated our entire understanding of what counted as impressive. I remember Osamir Krell watching Corwin's 8th shot land, then turning to me and saying in his usual flat tone, "Only 8, which is possibly the funniest thing I have ever heard a Verdane say, intentional or otherwise. Draxos Cull, to his credit, eventually came around. Several weeks after the original incident, I witnessed him approach Vesper, and rather than the arrogant challenge I expected, he actually apologized, admitting his comments had been unfair and his assumptions about humans had been badly mistaken. Vesper, being Vesper, just shrugged it off and said something about how everyone underestimates someone at some point, then offered to show him a few grip techniques that might help with his own marksmanship scores. Draxos' scores did, in fact, improve noticeably in the following weeks, which I found almost as surprising as the original incident because getting a Catherine to admit he was wrong about anything is roughly as difficult as getting a human to admit their species has any physical limitations whatsoever. So, here we are, months later, and I am still occasionally asked about this incident by curious cadets, new instructors, and even visiting dignitaries who have heard some garbled version of the story through the Coalition grapevine. I tell it pretty much the same way every time, though I admit my sarcasm level tends to fluctuate depending on how tired I am that particular day. What I always make sure to include, no matter how many times I retell this story, is the lesson I personally took away from watching Vesper Cain fire that forbidden rifle 10 times, one-handed, without so much as flinching. We spend so much time in the Coalition cataloging species by their claws, their armor, their venom, and their raw physical strength. We measure threat levels by teeth, muscle mass, and reaction speed. And then here come the humans. Soft, pink, mostly hairless, walking around with flat, useless teeth and skin that tears if you look at it wrong. And somehow, despite all of that, they turn out to be some of the most physically stubborn creatures the galaxy has ever produced. Not because they are naturally the strongest. Not because they have some biological advantage over the rest of us. But because, somewhere along their evolutionary path, they simply decided that pain, exhaustion, and physical limitation were negotiable concepts rather than absolute rules. I have trained soldiers from across this entire coalition, and I will tell you something honestly, something I would never have admitted 3 decades ago when I first started this job. The scariest thing in this galaxy is not the species with the biggest claws, the sharpest teeth, or the most venomous bite. The scariest thing in this galaxy is a species that looks at its own physical limits, shrugs, and decides those limits are more of a suggestion. So, if you ever find yourself standing across from a human and they seem calm, unbothered, maybe even a little bored, do not let that fool you. Somewhere underneath that soft, unassuming exterior is a creature perfectly capable of doing something utterly ridiculous simply because it felt like a reasonable thing to attempt at the time. Trust me, I watched it happen. 10 shots, 1 hand, and an entire academy's understanding of physical limitation completely and permanently shattered. Never underestimate the soft ones. That is the lesson here, plain and simple. Never, ever underestimate the soft ones.